The records from Ashford County, dated 1897, speak of a discovery so strange and unsettling that even the local authorities refused to comment on it for decades. When officials entered the decaying halls of the Whitmore plantation, they expected only dust, debts, and the slow rot of abandonment. What they found instead was a basement locked from the outside, a basement that held 23 children, each with eerily identical features. These children were not ordinary by any measure. Witnesses swore their eyes carried the same peculiar shade of gray-blue, their bone structures almost indistinguishable from one another. At first glance, one might have mistaken them for a schoolroom gathering of siblings, but they were too many, and the house had been empty for years. The smell of damp wood and mildew clung to the walls, but beneath it lingered something else, the faint, unmistakable scent of confinement. Authorities traced the plantation back to its last recorded mistress, Margaret Whitmore, a widow known for her sharp presence in local society. For years, she had been remembered as a woman of grace and refinement, her lineage tied to one of the wealthiest families in the county. But behind her polished exterior, whispers trailed her like shadows. Rumors of strange practices, of disappearances linked to her estate, of children vanishing from neighboring farms. And yet, no charges had ever been brought. No official statement ever survived in the county archives, aside from brief, sterile mentions of inspection and repossession. It was as though the truth had been deliberately erased, leaving only fragments in journals, half-burned letters, and the chilling testimony of those who dared enter the Whitmore home after it was abandoned. What makes the story darker still is how little remains of Margaret herself. Local records list her death in vague terms, unverified, presumed. No grave is marked with her name in Ashford County. Neighbors at the time claimed she had vanished in the same season the plantation fell silent. But in the scattered pages of a servant's diary, later recovered from the ruins, a single chilling entry survives. The children are quiet tonight. Miss Whitmore says they must always be kept below, until the time is right. She calls them her legacy, her perfect line. God forgive me, for I cannot look into their faces without trembling. Each one is the mirror of the last. It was this passage that first gave rise to the belief that the Whitmore estate had been the site of something far worse than neglect. Something deliberate, systematic, and inhuman. Witnesses who saw the children firsthand claimed their behavior was unsettling. They did not cry when taken outside. They did not run, did not scream. Instead, they moved together, their footsteps eerily synchronized, their eyes watching in unison. When asked their names, they each gave the same two answers: Clara for the girls, James for the boys. Doctors who examined them reported no immediate physical harm, but something in their manner disturbed even the most rational men of science. They seemed less like individuals, one physician wrote, and more like echoes of a single child repeated 23 times. For the people of Ashford County, the revelation spread like wildfire. Churches called it a curse. Neighbors swore Margaret had been practicing some perverse ritual of inheritance. Some claimed she sought to replace her deceased husband, Thomas Whitmore, who had died years earlier under mysterious circumstances, leaving her burdened with debts and the decline of her estate. But the most persistent rumor was this: that Margaret had engineered the children herself. Whether by coercion, ritual, or experiment, she had birthed, or caused to be birthed, a generation of children who were not meant to live as individuals, but as a single extension of her bloodline. The sheriff at the time ordered the children taken into custody, scattered across distant orphanages. Yet, curiously, no record survives of their adulthood. Not one of the 23 children can be traced beyond their early years. It is as if, once removed from the Whitmore house, they simply dissolved into silence, or were silenced by some larger hand. A local historian once wrote that the Whitmore legacy was a story the county itself wished to bury. The plantation was left to rot and eventually torn down. Today, nothing remains of it but a field of weeds, with only a foundation of crumbled stone marking where the great halls once stood. And yet, some who visit the land claim that at night they still hear voices. Children's voices repeating names that no longer belong to them. Clara, James, Clara, James. Whether Margaret Whitmore truly succeeded in creating her perfect line, or whether the children were victims of a horror that will never be fully uncovered, one thing is certain: the basement of Whitmore Plantation remains one of the most chilling discoveries in the history of Ashford County. If Chapter 1 begins with the discovery of the children, then Chapter 2 belongs to their keeper. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who oversaw the plantation and, according to most accounts, orchestrated the bizarre legacy that would stain Ashford County's history forever. Born Margaret Eliza Harrington in 1848, she had been raised in privilege. Her family's fortune came from cotton and shipping, her upbringing shielded by tutors and servants. Records describe her as educated, fluent in French, with an interest in philosophy and medicine, unusual pursuits for women of her class and era. Those who knew her as a girl remembered her as curious, sharp-eyed, and unafraid to question things. She married Thomas Whitmore in 1866, a man nearly 20 years her senior. He was one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, owner of vast tracts of farmland and the stately Whitmore Plantation. For a time, the match was celebrated, young Margaret securing her position, and Thomas boasting of his new wife's refinement. Together they were seen at church services, social gatherings, and county fairs, a portrait of prosperity. But prosperity rarely lasts forever. By the early 1880s, Thomas's fortunes were waning. Crops failed. Shipping profits fell. The debts grew heavy, and whispers of unpaid workers, mortgage defaults, and creditors began to surround the once proud family. And then in 1885 Thomas Whitmore died. The circumstances were, and remain, deeply contested. The official cause of death is listed as pneumonia, but neighbors remembered the rumors differently. Some claimed he fell ill after a violent argument with Margaret that echoed through the halls of the plantation. Others whispered of poison, pointing to the rapid decline of his health, the discoloration of his skin, and the fact that Margaret refused an autopsy. Whatever the truth, his death left Margaret the sole mistress of the estate, and the sole bearer of his debts. From that point forward, her reputation began to shift. Where once she had been seen as a socialite, she grew reclusive. She dismissed most of the household staff, citing financial strain, and locked herself away in the plantation. Visitors described strange sounds at night, crying, chanting, or the rhythm of many feet moving in unison. It was during these years, neighbors say, that the disappearances began. Between 1886 and 1892, at least 6 children from Ashford County were reported missing. A farmhand's boy, a preacher's daughter, 2 brothers from a nearby mill town, and others whose names faded from official record. In every case, searches were launched, but with little evidence and no witnesses, the trails went cold. No one dared accuse Margaret outright, but fear grew. Children were told not to wander near the Whitmore lands. Local pastors preached sermons about unnatural practices, warning their congregations of sins that recreate themselves. And yet, Margaret herself was rarely seen. The few who did glimpse her during this period described her as transformed. One woman later wrote, "She was no longer Margaret, the belle of Ashford County. Her eyes had a hunger in them, and her voice, when she spoke, was low, commanding, like a teacher reciting lessons none of us could understand. She did not walk as a widow grieving. She walked as if carrying a secret no one could wrest from her." By 1893, the estate was collapsing. Margaret's debts had mounted beyond saving. Creditors prepared to seize the plantation, and officials scheduled an inspection of the home. It was that inspection, delayed by bureaucratic confusion, which would eventually lead to the discovery of the basement children in 1897. But Margaret herself was gone. The last confirmed sighting of her comes from the spring of 1894. A trader passing through Ashford County claimed to have sold her supplies: candles, ink, preserved meats, and several crates of strong locks. He described her as pale, gaunt, but determined. Her hands shook when she signed her name, he said, but her eyes were steady, fixed like a woman with a plan. After that, she disappeared from all public record. No carriage bore her away. No ship manifest lists her name. No burial ground marks her grave. And yet, inside the Whitmore house, traces of her presence remained. In the charred fragments of her study, investigators recovered the remnants of a notebook. Most pages had been burned, but a few survived. On them were lists of names: Clara James, written over and over in tight, practiced script. In the margins, a phrase appeared again and again: "They will replace what was lost." Scholars have debated for years what she meant. Some believe she referred to her husband, Thomas, attempting to replicate him through children. Others argue she sought to create a bloodline that would live on in her name alone, free of men, free of decay. But there is a darker theory still. Some believe Margaret Whitmore did not disappear at all. that she remained in the house, hidden, watching. That the children found in the basement were not abandoned but waiting, held until she returned to lead them. Even today, some locals whisper that her body was never found because she never died. They claim that, on certain nights, a pale woman is seen wandering the fields where the plantation once stood, her hair long and unkempt, her voice calling out two names in the wind: Claire, James. Whether she perished in silence or lingers in shadow, Margaret Whitmore's vanishing remains one of the great mysteries of Ashford County. For while the children were found, their keeper was not, and without her, the truth of the Whitmore plantation may never be fully uncovered. If the vanished mistress was the shadow haunting Ashford County, then the only window into her intentions came from a single, battered notebook recovered years later from the ruins of Whitmore Plantation. Locals would come to call it the journal and cipher. The account of how it was discovered is as unsettling as its contents. In the autumn of 1897, shortly after the children were uncovered in the basement, county officials returned to the house to catalog what remained of Margaret Whitmore's estate. Furniture had rotted, walls were collapsing, and mildew coated nearly everything. But in the wreckage of a locked desk, pried open by an eager clerk, they found fragments of a leather-bound book. At first glance, it appeared worthless. Most pages were scorched or water-damaged. The writing was incomprehensible, a tight scrawl of symbols that resembled no language anyone recognized. Many assumed it was nothing more than a failed experiment in shorthand. The officials tossed the book into a box of other recovered artifacts and sent it to the county archives. For 3 years it sat untouched. Then in 1900, a young clerk named Daniel Mercer came across the journal while inventorying the archives. Mercer had a fondness for puzzles and ciphers, inspired by the works of Poe. He recognized almost immediately that the symbols followed a substitution pattern, letters of the alphabet disguised beneath unusual marks. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to decode them. What emerged was not a diary in the usual sense. It was a blueprint. Page after page detailed calculations, pairings, and notes on physical traits. Margaret's handwriting, once dismissed as elegant, almost artistic, became something far colder when rendered into English. She wrote of selections, desirable features, and failed results. Each line read less like the thoughts of a grieving widow and more like the records of a breeder cataloging livestock. One decoded passage reads: "Strength of bone to be matched with clarity of eye. Intelligence must be observed in early years, a quickness in numbers, in memory. Temperament crucial, docility preferred in women, vigor in men. If offspring fails, union must be restructured." Elsewhere, she described time frames, predicting the number of births that could be expected over 5-year intervals, mapping out generations in advance as though she were plotting a harvest schedule. Most chilling of all were the names. Dozens of them appeared in the margins: Isaac, Ruth, Samuel, Clara, James, repeated again and again with lines connecting them like branches of a family tree. Beside each name were cryptic notes: stubborn, quick hands, unreliable lungs, favorable jaw. It was not simply the obsession of a woman gone mad. It was organized, precise, deliberate. When Mercer presented his translation to county officials, there was uproar. Newspapers caught wind of the story, splashing lurid headlines across their pages. Secrets of the Widow Whitmore, a plantation of experiments? Cipher Journal reveals dark designs in Ashford County. The public was horrified. Some dismissed the journal as the ravings of a disordered mind, a Gothic fantasy born of grief and isolation. But others pointed to the children found in the basement, silent proof that something systematic had indeed occurred within the house. The more Mercer decoded, the clearer the picture became. Margaret had not simply intended to survive her husband's death. She had intended to build an empire of her own design, one that grew not from crops or trade but from bloodlines. In one translated entry she wrote, "They will not be free nor will they be sold. They will belong only to this place, to me, and to the generations that follow. They will not remember the world outside. They will not desire it. They will know only what I give them." Scholars have debated for over a century whether the journal was literal or symbolic, but in Ashford County, most accepted it as truth. Parents warned their children of the Whitmore woman who sought to make families out of shadows. Perhaps most disturbing was Mercer's final discovery. On the last intact page of the cipher, beneath the neat rows of symbols, was a single line written in plain English: "If they find me, they will never understand." If they do not, my children will carry me into eternity. That final sentence has been quoted endlessly in books, lectures, even whispered around campfires. Did Margaret truly believe she could live forever through the children she bred? Or was it merely the last flourish of a woman whose mind had long slipped from reality? What is certain is this: the journal turned Margaret Whitmore from a local ghost story into a national horror. Reporters traveled to Ashford County, artists sketched the ruined plantation, and ministers thundered from their pulpits about the dangers of godless science. And through it all, the children remained silent, their origins tied forever to the cipher of their vanished keeper. Even today, the journal rests in the county archive under glass. Many refuse to look at it. But those who have say the strangest thing is not what's written on the pages, but what lingers between the lines. A sense that the book is incomplete, as though Margaret had written much more, and that somewhere, perhaps still hidden, other volumes wait. If true, the cipher journal may be only the beginning. If the cipher journal revealed Margaret Whitmore's intentions, it was the children themselves who bore the marks of her plan. Their discovery remains one of the most unsettling moments in Ashford County's history. The basement of the Whitmore house had long been avoided, even by the officials cataloging the ruins. It smelled of damp stone and rot, and the stairwell was treacherous. But in November of 1897, when a group of men from the county were sent to clear debris, they pried open a warped door at the bottom of the east wing. What they found silenced them. 10 children. They were not infants, but boys and girls ranging from perhaps 4 to 12 years old. They were thin, pale, and wide-eyed, their skin nearly translucent from years with little sunlight. Their clothing was mismatched and ill-fitting, stitched from scraps of cloth. None of them spoke when the men entered. They simply stood in the half-dark, blinking, like creatures unaccustomed to the light. The eldest boy, later identified as Jonathan, stepped forward as though he had been taught to act as their spokesman. He offered no explanation, only a slow nod as if to confirm that they had been waiting. The county men were stunned. At first, they believed the children to be orphans abandoned during the war years. But as news spread and as fragments of the cipher journal began to surface, a darker theory emerged. These were Margaret's special children, raised apart from the others, products of her breeding design. What shocked observers most was not simply their existence, but their condition. Each child bore signs of deliberate cultivation. They were clean, their hair cut neatly, their bodies measured and monitored. In a hidden chamber adjoining the basement, officials found small chalk marks on the wall, recording each child's height at intervals. A chest contained folded papers with notations: Jonathan, strong hands; Eleanor, sharp memory; Abigail, compliant. It was not the care of a mother. It was the record of an overseer. The children themselves behaved in ways that disturbed the townspeople. They rarely cried, rarely asked questions, and seemed to move in quiet unison, as if they had been trained to act as a single body. When spoken to, they answered softly, in tones that echoed one another, almost rehearsed. One woman who witnessed them said, "They looked at you like they knew what you would say before you said it, like they were waiting for instructions." No child should look that way. The county debated what to do with them. Some argued they should be placed with families, given the chance to grow into ordinary lives. Others feared they were too deeply marked by Margaret's influence, that they were not merely children but vessels of her strange will. In the end, the solution was grimly practical. The eldest were sent to labor farms as apprentices, while the youngest were divided among households in Ashford. Yet even separated, the children carried something of the Whitmore estate with them. Reports surfaced of odd behaviors. Siblings found each other without being told where the other had gone, children who sat silently for hours, sketching symbols that resembled the cipher of Margaret's journal. One child, a girl called Caroline, was adopted by a merchant family in town. Within weeks, she was found arranging her toys in elaborate patterns, precise and mathematical. When her adoptive mother asked what she was doing, the girl whispered, "Mama taught me. We are meant to continue." The woman never asked her to explain again. By the turn of the century, most of the children had vanished into the margins of county records. A few are listed in census rolls, marked as servants or laborers. Others disappear entirely with no further trace. Rumors abound that they ran away, that they were reclaimed by some secret part of the Whitmore estate, that Margaret herself, if she lived, had sent for them. But in Ashford County, the memory of their discovery lingers. The phrase "the children below" became shorthand for anything uncanny, anything best left unspoken. Parents told their children never to wander near the ruins. Ministers preached that the Whitmore offspring were cursed. And among the elderly of Ashford, even decades later, a common fear remained, that the children had not disappeared at all, but had blended into the population, carrying Margaret's design forward in ways unseen. The cipher journal had promised generations. The children themselves were proof of its beginning. The question was never whether Margaret Whitmore had truly meant to build a new kind of family. The question was whether she had succeeded. The spring of 1882 was remembered for its warmth. The wheat fields outside the Missouri town swayed in golden waves, and the small church on the hill, whitewashed, wooden, and humble, stood as the pride of the congregation. By then, 80 souls made it their place of worship, men in worn suits, women in plain dresses, children in their Sunday best. No one could have predicted that within a single night, that church would be reduced to ash, and with it, every trace of those who prayed inside. The fire began without warning. Some said they heard no scream, no shout, no panicked rush of feet. Only the toll of the church bell rang out into the black sky, its iron clanging like a desperate cry. The bell was later found melted into a warped shape, its sound forever silenced. Neighbors described seeing the blaze from miles away. The flames were said to have been unnaturally high, licking at the heavens, the glow turning night into a false dawn. Yet when rescuers finally approached the hill, drawn by the inferno, they were halted by something none could explain. The fire burned, but no heat touched them. They could stand just a few yards from the burning church, feel the grass cool beneath their boots, and yet watch the flames consume the wooden beams as though the air itself fed it. Some swore they saw shadows moving inside, silhouettes of parishioners kneeling, their hands raised not in panic but in prayer. By morning the fire was gone. Where the church had stood, only blackened earth and smoking timbers remained. The air smelled of charred oak, but no bones, no bodies, no remains of cloth or flesh were ever discovered. Not even ash that could be traced to human form. It was as though the congregation had been erased. The town gathered at the ruins, stunned into silence. Mothers wept for lost children. Husbands searched frantically through the debris for wives. Farmers and laborers stood, hats clutched in their hands, unable to speak. 80 men, women, and children had gone into that church. Not a single one came out. Sheriff Thomas Carver led the investigation. A stern man with gray streaks in his beard, he refused to accept what his eyes told him. "Fire leaves bones," he repeated over and over, as though the words themselves could anchor reason in the face of madness. His men sifted through every inch of soot, digging deep into the ground where pews had once rested. Nothing. When Carver spoke to the families, his voice was heavy but resolute. There must be an explanation. This town deserves one. Yet he, too, avoided looking directly at the hill at night. For those who dared linger past dusk, strange sights were reported. Flickering lights danced where the church had once stood, faint as candle flames. Others said the sound of a hymn drifted faintly on the wind, voices singing from no visible mouth. The families, though stricken with grief, began to turn their sorrow into questions. Why had no one screamed? Why had no one attempted to escape? If the fire burned so strangely, why had no one been scorched on their way out? And why, most of all, were there no remains? Whispers grew in town, the kind that come when grief cannot find answers. Some said the congregation had been taken, spirited away by forces they had unknowingly summoned. Others recalled that just weeks before the fire, Reverend Elijah Moore had preached of visions he received in prayer, "a cleansing flame," he had called it, "that shall carry the faithful home." At the time, his words were seen as poetic. Now they seemed like prophecy. A diary belonging to Moore was found in the parsonage beside the ruins. The final entry chilled those who read it. "The Lord's fire approaches. Tonight we shall not fear it. We shall embrace it. For in the fire lies the doorway, and beyond the doorway lies peace." The diary was dismissed publicly as the words of a man too consumed by faith, perhaps even touched by madness. But privately some whispered, had he led his people willingly into the flames? Had he known what was coming? In the weeks that followed, the hill was left untouched. No attempt was made to rebuild. Grass began to grow over the blackened ground, though in a strange pattern, circle upon circle, as though scorched marks beneath the soil continued to shape the earth. Travelers avoided the path near the hill at night. Horses balked and refused to climb it. Children dared each other to run across the ground, but those who did often returned pale, claiming they felt hands brush against their legs, or heard the murmur of voices just below the soil. The town itself began to wither. With so many lost, farms went untended, shops were closed. Families left, unwilling to remain where their loved ones had vanished. Within a year, nearly half the population had abandoned the settlement, leaving behind only the echo of what once had been. But the story of the fire spread beyond Missouri. Newspapers from St. Louis to New York carried the tale: 80 parishioners vanish in church fire, no remains found. Skeptics scoffed, claiming poor reporting or a botched investigation. Scientists argued that fire, under the right conditions, could reduce bodies entirely to ash. But even among them, doubt lingered. For every claim of natural explanation, someone else pointed to the sheriff's official report, where a single line struck terror into those who read it. It is as though they were not burned but taken. The fire became more than tragedy, it became legend. And like all legends, it carried a warning. Locals began to speak of the hill as cursed ground. Some even claimed that on the anniversary of the fire, the church reappeared, glowing faintly against the night, its windows lit, its doors closed, and the sound of hymns spilling out. None who told such tales dared climb the hill to see for themselves. Years later, when strangers passed through the abandoned town and asked what had happened, those few who remained would only shake their heads. The church burned, they would say. And it took them all. No one ever built on that hill again. 4 months after the fire, Sheriff Thomas Carver carried the weight of the town's loss in his pocket, a small leather-bound notebook filled with his handwritten accounts of the investigation. At first, the notes were matter-of-fact: measurements, sketches of the burned site, lists of names of the missing. But as the weeks turned into months, the entries grew less like reports and more like confessions. The notebook was never meant for public eyes. Yet decades later, when it was discovered in an old trunk at the courthouse, its pages revealed the turmoil of a man who had seen more than he wished to believe. The first entry, dated April 12, 1882, began plainly enough. The church fire consumed the building within the hour. Flames unlike any I've seen. At least 80 souls presumed dead. Search has turned up no remains. Impossible. Fire leaves bones. Fire leaves teeth. But we found nothing but earth and ash. He underlined the word nothing 3 times. Over the next few days, Carver recorded his methodical efforts. He described the ash sifted through by hand, the timbers turned over, the ground dug up until the men's shovels struck hard clay. Not a single bone, button, or nail from a shoe was recovered. He noted his frustration. Even if the flames had been hot enough to cremate, clothing and iron should remain. Yet we found no pins, no buckles, no belt clasps. It is as though every trace of them vanished. Carver's tone shifted in later entries. The confidence of a man of law gave way to the troubled words of someone doubting his own senses. April 17th. Last night I returned to the hill alone. The moon was bright, and I wished to see the lay of the ruins myself without the chatter of men. At the very hour the fire began 1 week ago, I swear I heard the bell toll again. What? Clear as any church bell. But there is no bell, only a lump of melted iron. I left quickly. April 23rd. Mrs. Clayton insists she heard her daughter's voice outside her window, calling her name. The girl was among the lost. I told her grief can conjure such things. But she swore the voice was clear, and when she opened her window, she saw footprints in the dirt below. Small ones. The testimonies poured into his office. Men spoke of hymns carried on the wind long after midnight. A farmhand said he saw shapes moving where the church had stood, kneeling figures that did not vanish until dawn. Carver recorded them all, yet his skepticism eroded with each telling. May 5th. I can no longer call these tales nonsense. Too many see the same. I myself returned again to the hill. This time I brought my deputy. At midnight we both heard it, voices in chorus singing low. The words were muffled as though sung behind thick walls. The sound came from beneath the earth. We left shaken. May 21st. The Reverend's diary troubles me. His final words speak of fire as a doorway. Did he lead them into it knowingly? If so, then I fear they did not perish. They went somewhere else. Somewhere the fire delivered them. To call it heaven would be to comfort ourselves. But if heaven leaves no bodies behind, what kind of place was it? By June, the sheriff's handwriting had grown erratic. His notes began to include sketches of circles, overlapping rings, sometimes drawn so hard the pencil tore the page. He marked the hill with a map, showing where grass grew back strangely in concentric patterns. He began to doubt that the fire was of earthly origin. June 9th. A child from town claimed to see the church whole again. Said she walked past the hill and saw lights in its windows, people singing inside. She called out to them, but they did not answer. When she blinked, it was gone. The hill was bare. She is only 6, yet her description of the hymn matches the very one my deputy and I heard. June 15th. I dreamed of the fire. I stood inside the church, the flames rising all around me, and yet I felt no heat. The people were kneeling, calm, their eyes fixed not on the pulpit but on the flames themselves, as if they were waiting to be consumed. I woke drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke in my room though no fire had burned. By midsummer, Carver's notes grew sparse, interrupted by long silences. It was said in town that he rarely slept, that his beard grew unkempt, his clothes ragged. He was haunted by what he could not explain. His final entries, dated late August, carried a dreadful resignation. I can no longer deny it. This was not a fire of nature. The congregation was taken, spirited away by something that called them. Reverend Moore's words were not prophecy but instruction. They obeyed. And then, the very last line of his notebook. The fire will come again. And when it does, I fear I too will answer. The notebook ended abruptly. Sheriff Carver vanished later that year, riding out toward the hill one autumn evening and never returning. His horse was found grazing near the edge of the woods, his badge tucked neatly into the saddlebag. The town spoke of his disappearance in hushed tones, some saying he had been taken by the same force as the congregation, others claiming he'd lost his mind and wandered into the wilderness. Yet his notes remained, hidden away until the courthouse itself was abandoned decades later. For those who have read the sheriff's words, one truth stands clear. The fire was not an accident. It was a calling. By 1857, nearly 5 years had passed since the church fire, and yet Ashford had not recovered. Cotton still grew in the fields, wagons still rolled down the dusty roads, but beneath it all lingered a silence that outsiders noticed immediately. The town was haunted, not only by grief but by expectation. Word of the living dead of Ashford had spread far beyond the county. Traveling preachers warned their flocks of demonic apparitions. Newspapers hinted at cult activity. Some whispered that the state would soon intervene, if only to prevent the rumors from infecting neighboring communities. That intervention finally came in the autumn of 1857. The governor of Missouri, pressured by local landowners who feared their property values would collapse if the tales continued, dispatched 2 men. Judge Elias Merriweather, a stern lawyer known for quashing superstition, and Reverend Josiah Hale, a fiery preacher with ties to the Methodist Conference. Their mission was simple: to put an end to the talk of survivors and restore Ashford's reputation. The townspeople, however, were divided. Some begged for answers, desperate to know whether their lost kin truly walked again. Others feared that stirring the matter would only draw the congregation back in more terrible form. Judge Merriweather began with the sheriff's notebook. He studied the entries carefully, tracing each name and testimony. He dismissed much of it as delusion. "Grief makes children of us all," he wrote in his report. "They see what they wish to see." But Reverend Hale took a different view. He visited the very ruins of the church, kneeling in the weeds that now grew through the cracked foundation. There he claimed he felt an oppressive heat though the day was cool. His notes, preserved by his family, describe a sensation like breathing the air of a furnace, yet no smoke nor flame was present. That evening, Hale gathered the townspeople in the courthouse and demanded they speak the truth. What followed was the largest collection of testimonies ever recorded about the Ashford fire. Families repeated the same stories, voices calling from the dark, apparitions at their windows, hymns sung in the night. One man swore under oath that his brother had visited him in his home, seated by the fire, speaking little but leaving behind a Bible marked with ash. The Bible was produced in court, its pages warped, though no one could explain how. Judge Merriweather grew impatient. "This is hysteria," he thundered. "No bodies were found because the fire consumed them utterly. You are feeding the imagination of fools." But then came the testimony of Pearl Jennings, a girl of just 14. She stood trembling before the crowd, clutching the hem of her dress, and spoke in a thin voice. "I saw them all," she said. "Not once but many times. They gather at the church when the moon is low. They do not burn. They do not speak. But they sing and their voices sound like fire itself. My father says I am dreaming. But I have gone to the ruins and seen them with my own eyes. They wait for something." Her words unsettled the room. Reverend Hale demanded an inquiry at once. Judge Merriweather scoffed but reluctantly agreed to visit the church ruins under cover of night. That night, accompanied by the sheriff, Reverend Hale, and a handful of townspeople, Merriweather stood among the blackened stones. The moon was thin, casting weak silver light across the clearing. At first nothing stirred. But then, soft, low, unmistakable, came the sound of singing. It began as a hum, a vibration in the earth. Then words formed. A hymn, but not one any of the living recognized. It was slow, heavy, filled with strange cadences. The sheriff whispered that it was the same melody he had once heard beneath the earth with his deputy. Shapes flickered among the ruins, shadows, though no fire burned. One by one, figures appeared at the far end of the clearing, pale in the moonlight, walking with dreadful calm. Judge Merriweather fell silent. He would later insist the figures were tricks of the light, but those present swore they saw faces, faces they knew. Husbands, wives, children. Oh, unburned. Eyes fixed forward as if bound to an unseen command. Reverend Hale fell to his knees, praying loudly, calling on the name of Christ. The singing grew louder. The ground trembled. Several of the witnesses fled into the woods, swearing never to return. The sheriff later recorded in his notes, "They did not see us. Or perhaps they did but did not care. They moved in silence save for their song, their faces blank as stone. When the hymn ended, they were gone." Judge Merriweather ordered silence. He threatened those present with charges of blasphemy and warned that repeating what they had seen would invite ruin on them all. His official report to the governor stated only, "The tragedy of Ashford Church was an unfortunate fire with no survivors. Any reports of hauntings are the product of grief or hysteria. No further investigation is necessary." But Reverend Hale refused silence. From the pulpit he declared Ashford a cursed place. He claimed the congregation had not died but been taken by the fire as a living offering. He warned that unless the town repented, the fire would come again. His words spread like wildfire. Attendance at his sermons swelled, but so too did fear. Farmers abandoned their land. Merchants closed their shops. Ashford began to wither, its name whispered only in warning. The state, eager to end the scandal, quietly reassigned Hale to a distant parish. Judge Merriweather's report was filed away, never revisited. The sheriff, left alone with his notebook, wrote the final chilling words of that year. "The law has failed us. The church has failed us. What walks in Ashford is not grief, nor delusion, nor the devil's play. It is something older. Something that will return when the fire calls again." The investigation meant to silence the rumors had only given them new life. What should have been an ending became a beginning of darker speculation. And still, in the fields and cabins of Ashford, the people waited. Not for peace, not for truth, but for the night when the congregation would walk once more. By 1859, Ashford was no longer a town but a shadow of one. The fields that once yielded cotton in neat white rows grew wild with weeds. The blacksmith's forge, once ringing with the sound of hammer on iron, sat rusting in silence. Even the children, those few still left, did not laugh or play in the streets. They walked quickly, eyes lowered, as if afraid to be seen by something just beyond sight. Families who could afford to leave had already done so. Wagons rolled out one after another, bound for safer counties, leaving behind only those too poor, too proud, or too fearful to abandon the land of their fathers. The town that had once boasted over 200 souls now counted barely 60. The courthouse, once the proud center of Ashford's civic life, was shuttered. The judge's bench gathered dust. In the pews of the Methodist chapel, cracks spread across the wood as termites hollowed out the structure from within. The congregation that gathered on Sundays numbered fewer than 10, and even they sang their hymns quietly as if not to disturb the unseen. But at the ruins of the burned church, there was no silence. Travelers who dared to pass along the old road swore that the air thickened near the site, the very trees bending inward as though trying to conceal what lay inside. At night, voices still carried on the wind. Not every evening, sometimes weeks passed with nothing, but when it came, the sound of the hymns was unmistakable. And with those hymns, people vanished. In the spring of 1859, a farmer named Gideon Rowe left his house to fetch water from the creek and never returned. His pail was found overturned near the ruins of the church, the ground blackened as if burned, though no fire had touched it. A month later, two sisters, Abigail and Ruth Miller, disappeared while walking home from a neighbor's cabin. Their mother claimed she heard singing through the trees that night, soft at first and then rising until the windows shook. The sheriff, weary from years of unanswered questions, recorded each case in his notebook. But his entries grew shorter, his words trembling across the page. In one note he simply wrote, "They do not come for the living at random. They choose. And those chosen do not resist." It was during this time that the town's elders attempted one final act of resistance. With Judge Meriwether long gone and Reverend Hale reassigned, the people turned to an older tradition, one whispered from the Scots-Irish settlers who had first carved farms into the Missouri wilderness. They called it a cleansing. On a moonless night, a group of 12 men gathered at the ruins, armed not with muskets but with salt, iron nails, and a Bible placed open on the scorched foundation stone. They circled the site 3 times, scattering salt into the weeds, hammering nails into the earth as they went. The leader, a farmer named Elias Carter, read aloud from the Book of Revelation, calling upon the final judgment to banish the congregation once and for all. The story of what happened next came down only through whispers. Some said a wind rose from the ground itself, scattering the salt, bending the nails until they snapped. Others claimed the hymn began again, but this time not from the ruins, from behind them. When the men turned, they saw figures lined along the trees, pale faces watching, eyes unblinking. Only 6 of the 12 returned. The rest were never seen again. After that night, no one attempted another cleansing. Ashford gave itself to silence. By 1860, the census taker marked the town's population at just 31. The courthouse was abandoned, its windows broken by storms. The schoolhouse door hung loose on its hinges, chalk still faintly visible on the blackboard inside. Arithmetic lesson March 12th. The date mocked the emptiness. Those who remained lived like exiles in their own land. They avoided the road past the ruins. They barred their doors at night, shuttered their windows, and prayed that if the congregation returned, they would pass them by. But even within their homes, peace did not come. Children woke screaming in the night, swearing they heard voices at the windows. One widow claimed her late husband stood outside her door each evening at dusk, whispering her name until the sun rose. The sheriff's final entries from this period were brief, almost incoherent. He wrote of faces seen in mirrors, of hymns heard even in daylight, of a gathering storm that no man can prevent. His notebook ended in December 1860 with a line that later generations would repeat in hushed tones. Ashford belongs not to the living. It belongs to the fire, and the fire waits. That winter the last families began to flee. Some vanished without ever reaching the next county, their wagons found overturned on the road. Others made it safely to distant towns but carried with them the curse of Ashford. Wherever they settled, strange stories followed. Candles burning without flame, voices humming through the walls, children vanishing from their beds. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, Ashford was no longer counted among Missouri's living towns. Maps still marked it, but travelers avoided it, taking long detours rather than pass its haunted streets. The old church ruins remained, overgrown with ivy, but those who strayed too near claimed the stones still smoked as if the fire had never gone out. And the hymns never ceased. Not every night, not even every month, but always when the moon was low and the air turned still, the voices would rise again, carrying across the abandoned fields, reminding all who heard that Ashford was not dead. It was only waiting. The last remnants of autumn had already given way to the brittle winds of early winter in Hollowford. A gray frost blanketed the rooftops and gravestones alike, as though the entire town had been swallowed by a pall of silence. The story of the Ellsworth family was no longer confined to hushed whispers in taverns or cautious murmurs exchanged between neighbors. It had become an undeniable scar carved into the heart of the town itself. For weeks, investigators had combed through the remains of the Ellsworth estate. Their reports offered little clarity. Rooms bore no evidence of struggle, no forced entry, no clear traces of violence. The official documents simply declared absence unexplained, yet the personal accounts from those who dared step into the house spoke of something far less earthly. A carpenter named Jonas Merrick, who had been hired to board up the windows of the abandoned home, never set foot inside again after his first day. He told his wife that while hammering shut the parlor, he heard the faint sound of a child humming a lullaby, though the family's 2 children had disappeared weeks earlier. Another worker claimed the mirrors inside the house reflected not his own face, but something else, something watching him with a hunger that did not belong to this world. And still the house stood, silent, waiting. In the following weeks, the town council of Hollowford considered burning the Ellsworth property to the ground, but the priest, Father Alaric, warned against it. He said that fire does not purge what is rooted in darkness, it only feeds it. He advised instead that the home be sealed, locked away as a cursed relic, never to be disturbed. Some agreed. Others argued that sealing the home would only let the evil fester. But in the end, fear outweighed reason, and the Ellsworth house was left intact. What the council didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that the evil did not stop at the property line. Neighbors began reporting figures lingering at the edge of the woods, staring silently at their homes. One woman claimed she saw Margaret Ellsworth standing outside her window in the dead of night, her dress torn and her eyes wide, as though she were caught in an endless scream. When the woman screamed herself, Margaret vanished. Soon, livestock were found slaughtered in fields without explanation, their carcasses untouched by wolves or men. Horses grew restless at night, refusing to go near the path that led toward the Ellsworth home. Even the dogs of Hollowford whined and scratched at their doors whenever the wind carried the faint toll of a bell, though no church bells had been rung at that hour. It was as though the curse of the Ellsworths had seeped beyond their walls, spilling into every corner of Hollowford. One bitter evening, Father Alaric gathered the townsfolk inside the chapel. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the pews. His voice trembled as he addressed them. "What we face is not of this earth. We are not fighting flesh but shadow. The Ellsworth family was not taken by death as we know it. They were claimed. If we do not remain vigilant, Hollowford may be next." His words brought no comfort. Some broke down in tears, while others stared at the wooden floor, too afraid to meet each other's eyes. That night, a boy named Caleb, no older than 12, vanished from his bed. His mother swore she saw a pale hand clutch her son's shoulder as he was pulled into the darkness. The boy was never found. The panic grew. Families began leaving Hollowford, abandoning their homes and livelihoods in search of safety elsewhere. Yet no matter how far they traveled, stories emerged of strange dreams, of hearing whispers in the night, of seeing fleeting shadows of the Ellsworths standing just out of reach. It was as though the curse followed them, a stain that refused to be washed away. Months passed. The Ellsworth home decayed in silence, ivy climbing its walls and frost claiming its windows. By spring, the once grand estate resembled a mausoleum, its blackened timbers standing as a grim reminder of what had been lost. Travelers passing through Hollowford avoided the property altogether, some crossing themselves, others quickening their pace until the cursed house was behind them. And yet, from time to time, someone dared to look too long to linger at the edge of the road. Those who did often returned with stories. Of a woman singing in the upper window. Of a candle glowing in the nursery, though the house had no light. Of children's laughter echoing across the fields at midnight. Most dismissed these as tricks of the mind. But the people of Hollowford knew better. Years later, long after the last member of the town council had died and Father Alaric's warnings were faded echoes in the annals of history, the house still stood. Its walls were broken, its roof sagged, but its presence was unbroken. A group of scholars from a nearby city came to investigate the local legends. They entered the Ellsworth estate with notebooks, lanterns, and confidence, mocking the idea that shadows could linger after death. By dawn, none of them had returned. Their wagons were left outside the gate, their belongings untouched. Inside the house, the lanterns still burned faintly in the hallways, but the scholars themselves were gone, swallowed by the silence that had claimed all before them. The town of Hollowford never welcomed outsiders again. Even now, when the winter wind cuts across the abandoned fields, travelers say they hear the faint cry of Margaret Ellsworth calling for her children. Some say if you walk too close to the ruins of the estate, you may feel a hand brush against your shoulder as though urging you inside. The Ellsworth family was never found. Their fate remains unwritten. But one truth lingers: in Hollowford the shadows never left. And so the Ellsworths remain a mystery that time refuses to bury. Their home still stands, a scar on Hollowford's land, where whispers outlive the living. Was it madness? Was it curse? Or something far darker than we can name? One thing is certain: some stories never end, they only wait,